Order. Welcome to the first meeting of the Business and Trade Committee's subcommittee on economic crime, arms and export control. Today we are looking at the UK's enforcement regime against economic crime. I'm really grateful to our witnesses who have worked in this field for a long time for joining us this afternoon. Thank you very much for sparing us the time and the expertise today. Dan Neidle, perhaps I could start with you. So we're about 18 months on from the last Economic Crime Act. We have invested lots of money in beefing up Companies House. Does the UK now have a world-class enforcement regime for tackling economic crime?
We have a different problem from everyone else. So I think quite often people look at the reports on Companies House produced by Ray, me and others and say, oh, Companies House is a disaster, we're the worst in the world. And that's almost certainly not true. I bet the French and German registers are full of problems. Companies House is unusually transparent and its technology is unusually good and unusually open, so we're able to see these problems. So I don't want to be too mean about Companies House.
No.
The other, my personal pet theory is that Companies House is a victim of his own success. So back when I trained as a lawyer in the late 90s, Companies House operated on microfiche, and you turned up in person to Companies House. And it was the same way it had been for over 100 years. So the likelihood of anyone turning up to Companies House and fraudulently incorporating a company is pretty small. And certainly the likelihood of anyone from China doing that was zero. Companies House then went through an amazing digital transformation, created one of the best platforms in the world, made it incredibly easy to incorporate a company. And I rather suspect no one thought, how are bad people going to react to this? How is this going to be abused? And what happened was that by accident we'd created something which enabled very large-scale fraud by people across the world. And so that's where we find ourselves with
We've created a system that's world-class at enabling people to set up corporate fraud.
Yes, I think we have. And whilst I'm sure there's fraudulent companies in France and Germany, it's easier to do it in the UK. And a UK company also has a certain prestige, which is why you see UK fake companies used in China, used in Nigeria, used across the world to defraud not British people, but Nigerians and Chinese. So we have an unusual problem. It's a problem that's hard to solve just because of the sheer numbers. There's 5 million UK incorporated companies, something like 700,000 incorporated every year. So loads and a similar number disappear every year. If it costs £50 to incorporate a company, what have you got to lose from incorporating a fake company?
We had a big debate here in Parliament, in the last Parliament, about strengthening the regime for tackling economic crime. Hundreds of hours of debate, tens of millions of pounds of new money goes into Companies House. Here we find ourselves a year and a half on, and your work has exposed hundreds of bogus companies that have been, for example, set up as banks with allegedly trillions of pounds worth of assets. That doesn't sound like the enforcement regime has got stronger.
It may just be that there is so much bad stuff at Companies House that no matter how many people are working on this, it's a hopeless endeavour, and there are just too many. It's just too easy to set up new fraudulent companies. So I don't want to be too harsh on Companies House. For me, there needs to be a step change, not in the regulations and the rules, but in the enforcement. Because if you have rules and they're not enforced, they may as well not exist. So
would you say the enforcement's not yet in the right place?
Well, we published some figures today around the prosecutions of people for breaching the PSC rules, breaching the rules requiring disclosure of beneficial ownerships. And when the PSC rules came in 2016, there were, I think, 43 prosecutions under these rules. In 2022, there were none. In the first quarter of 2023, there were 4. If you don't enforce these rules, people are going to ignore them.
Yeah. Okay. Mr. Blake, what's your view? Is the enforcement regime, a year and a half on from the Act, in the right place?
Well, the direction of travel is the right direction, certainly. It is, rather hackneyed to compare this to a tanker that takes a while to turn around, but, the reality is that's where we are. Companies House And I'm sure the Companies House representatives will speak about their roadmap to implementing all of their powers under the ECCTA. But even that foresees quite a long time until everything that they've been promised is online, requiring secondary legislation and lots of technological retooling.
So should we be building this enforcement regime faster than we're building it today?
I think it would be helpful, certainly. Yeah.
Louise, Hodges, what's your view?
Well, I think I'll probably echo what's been said before. I think it's really Companies House trying to transform from what was a sort of benign register to actually having the capability and ability to be an active gatekeeper. And that's a huge transformation, and it's not something that happens overnight. And I'm sure Companies House are improving every day in terms of how they're doing that. And I suppose it's the mechanism to draw out those red flags and actually identify the what is a key wrongdoer as opposed to just somebody who's completed forms incorrectly. So it's really that triaging that's the significant bit.
So is the enforcement regime as strong as we would like it to be today?
Well, Companies House, I think it's a capability rather than whether we need more regulation.
Is the enforcement regime as strong as it needs to be today?
I suspect it's not, no.
Okay. Ben, what's your view?
I think the foundations have now been laid for a strong enforcement regime with the ECTA Act. And we've seen that being put in place slowly over the last year. So we now have the ACSP regime kicking in, and we'll have verification kicking in soon. But these things will take a while to fully take force. So I think we've seen tens of thousands of interjections by Companies House into instances where information might be incorrect, or they've stopped companies being incorporated altogether. But when you look at tens of thousands of individual pieces of information, the actual true number of incorrect information, false filings and that kind of thing is probably far higher than that. So the ball is rolling. It's just up to us to sort of ensure that gets quicker and quicker.
Yeah, can I just, Mr. Neidle, you explained how we had a sort of world-class company registration system, but essentially the opening up through the internet and had created a unmanageable system, if you like. I mean, that's the essence of what's happened. So as you look to the future, I mean, notwithstanding the regulations that we put in with the new legislation and the resourcing, we come on to the resourcing of it, I mean, are we in danger of just catching up to what is acceptable by the terms of reference over the last 5 years and the problems we've seen? Or are we missing something in terms of where the next challenges come? Because, we're talking about something that is not yet fully implemented from the last piece of legislation. How do you sort of see whether this is, wise enough in terms of anticipating the next threats that could come?
So an example of that would be the ID requirements that are coming in very soon. So it should no longer be possible for me to set up a company with Liam Byrne as one of the directors.
You haven't done that, have you?
As you probably know, just about the only prosecution that was ever made for someone for incorporating a company falsely was someone who stuck a couple of cabinet ministers as directors against their knowledge. So no, I have not done that, Mr. Byrne. So how will bad guys respond to that? One is obviously fake IDs, but there's lots of established methodologies in the ML world to get good IDs, so that maybe is less of a concern. The other trend which we're likely to see increasing is the use of what I call Muppets. So a Muppet is some normal person living in a normal house who on Facebook sees an amazing offer to get £100 or £500 for doing nothing. And what they're being asked to do is be the director of a UK company on behalf of unknown bad people. And that is already happening to a very large degree. But when it becomes impossible to use fake IDs, Muppets will become a lot more attractive. Yeah. What do you do about Muppets? IDs obviously doesn't solve it because they really are real people. You can have a succession of dire warnings when someone signs up as a director on Companies House saying, if you're doing this at the behest of someone else, you're committing an offence. But ultimately, I think you have to have prosecutions. This tends to turn me into a lock them up and throw away the key kind of person. That until we have very visible prosecutions, then bad actors will continue, and people who are somewhat innocent but also somewhere between foolish, naive and themselves bad actors will be drawn in and become muppets and act in other ways to help the wrongdoers.
What you're saying is that you can anticipate that I think all of you seem to think that there's the foundations for a better system, but actually you need a more proactive use of the interrogation of the data and what to do with it if you're going to actually send signals that are going to change behaviours in the light of that ID issue. And
yes, and you need very visible prosecutions to encourage
which
the
we
others.
don't have at the moment.
Which we don't have. The one particular problem is with foreign directors. Obviously, you cannot prosecute or even fine or probably even write to a foreign director. So what do? When you talk to people in the Caymans or Jersey, they're amazed at how Companies House operates, because in most countries like that, I should probably say tax havens, I couldn't incorporate a company myself. I would have to go through a licensed incorporation agent. Here we've taken the policy decision, probably correctly, that we don't want to put barriers in the way of small businesses, so anyone can incorporate a company. Fair enough. But if you've a company which has no UK directors, only has foreign directors, we don't really care about introducing more barriers in the way of making it more difficult for people who are not genuine to set up a company. So I would prohibit a company from having only foreign directors unless it has a UK agent acting for it. And that gives us a way to hold those companies to account. Right now, you should ask the Companies House representatives later, but I think we have nothing.
Okay, thank you. Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Cowdock, so your organisation, Transparency International, has warned that limited partnerships and limited liability partnerships can act as a loophole to facilitate money laundering and sanctions evasion. So can you sort of describe how that can happen and the way in which they can be used?
Yeah, absolutely. So LLPs and limited partnerships can often appear to be offshore companies with a UK wrapper. So you can have a UK LLP, and then above that will be sitting potentially a company in Dominica and a company in Belize as the general and limited partners. So what you have is essentially what we were talking about earlier, barely touching the UK entity, which can then be controlled from anywhere around the world. And this has made them really, really attractive to money launderers, crooks, sanctioned individuals. So we did some analysis a few years back and found that 1 in 10 LLPs were structured in a way that was identical to the ones being used in industrial scale money laundering schemes. And then when we looked at SLPs a few years earlier, 71% of those are being structured in a similar way as well. So this scale of their use is really significant in money laundering and corruption. And our colleagues at Transparency International Russia, who are now operating in exile, put out a report that was in November last year, and they found that these are still being used by people in occupied Ukraine, companies in occupied Ukraine to export critical minerals around the world. They're being even used by the FSB to procure military goods. So these are really important tools in the arsenals of money launderers and corrupt individuals.
Can I just pause you for a second? So do you think that there are LLPs that are currently registered at Companies House which are being used as vehicles for sanctions evasion today?
Yeah, there'll be undoubtedly LLPs being used in this kind of activity. If you look at trade data, they're being used either directly to send goods to Russia or potentially to third countries as well to sort of circumvent sanctions as well. So these are still being used and abused. I was looking on the internet this morning for how to set up an LLP, and when you look at Russian language company formation websites, you have people offering to set you up an SLP, a Welsh limited partnership, an LLP in Russian language, catering to a Russian market. I found 3 websites offering this just today, just a simple Google in Russian. So these are very much readily available and available at the moment. So in terms of how we tackle this, there's already a huge population on Companies House that need to be looked at by the police. The formation agents need to be looked at by HMRC, and Companies House themselves need to be taking closer attention to what exactly is on the register. And then going forward, we need to stop the supply of these dangerous companies to crooks and sanctioned individuals by clamping down on the rogue formation agents, setting them up, because it is more often than not formation agents doing this, because it's quite a complex process. It requires you to be in multiple jurisdictions at once.
Thank you. So you've obviously identified some of the ways that you try to mitigate that risk now, and I know that Mr. Neidle also set out some examples, but perhaps I could come to other members of the panel and start with you, Ms. Hodges, about whether there's anything that you think could be done to mitigate these types of risks.
It's the first time I've heard about these risks today, and I haven't read the report, but it does sound fascinating and concerning, and presumably with no real toehold in this jurisdiction, then actually law enforcement being able to deal with it, it's really beyond the reach. So I suppose it's a case of trying to prevent rather than being able to use enforcement in those circumstances.
Mm. Would you like to follow up on that?
Well, prevention is absolutely necessary because a company only needs to be in existence for an hour or so to then use that incorporation to do all sorts of other things, to set up other legal structures, to set up banking facilities. And its subsequent, strike off will not erase all of those tools that have been acquired. It's a bit like when fraudsters assume another identity, and they do it by using a birth certificate of someone who died years and years and years ago as a child. They only need that certificate for a moment or two to create a whole legend that then becomes self-sustaining.
Thank you.
Mr. Neidle, any observations on?
Just to add to what Ray said, which is why Companies House clearing things up after the event is of limited assistance, because by the time they get round to it, probably the fraud, the money laundering, whatever that company was doing, is done. We need to put spokes in the way of these companies establishing. One way is for Companies House to be smarter about having red flags raised when there are suspicious elements. For example, if someone incorporates a company with 100 million share capital, that's an unusual thing. That should, I would think, justify manual review. In fact, there's many companies with billions, even trillions of assets, obviously fictitious. They just sailed through incorporation. So red flags would be one way to do it. More aggressive prosecution is another. And as I said earlier, having a requirement that a company or LLP with no UK members or directors, that it must have a UK representative, would make it harder to implement some of these frauds.
Thank you very much. Mr. Glenn.
Yeah, could I ask about the resourcing of the regime to fight economic crime? Because you can get the right legislation in place, and we've just discussed the journey to its full sort of implementation. But this is quite a complicated area with lots of different agencies and actors involved in supervising and executing. How do you all see whether there's an effective and properly resourced regime to fight economic crime in place in this country at this point? Louise, would you like to start?
I'm here partly, I think, because the City of London Law Society, the committee that I chair, wrote a paper in 2023 in relation to the Serious Fraud Office. And just to put that in context, it was at the time we were just about to have a new director, but when we were drafting it, we were hearing about the proliferation of fraud, and the figures of 40% of crime is fraud related, and between 1% and 2% of the resources that are given to fighting crime is devoted to fraud. And there seemed to be little response to that at the time. Now, since then, we have had the economic crime plan and we've had the fraud strategy. And so they clearly are giving a vision of how these matters could be dealt with. But I think going back to the Serious Fraud Office, as an agency that is trying to deal with the most complex, serious international offences, they need to be well resourced, and at the moment I think they are not having sufficient.
There is a vote in the House, so the committee will suspend in a moment. Mr. Glenn, do you want to just...
Can I just sort of follow up on that and say, well, what more resources do you think need to... Because, I was Chief Secretary for a while. Everyone always wants more resources. What sort of quantum are you talking about for that entity? And perhaps then we can come in afterwards and talk about other entities that need more and how much.
Well, I think think resources in the broadest sense, obviously there's financial resources and being able to pay your staff at a competitive rate, etc. That there's those types of resources. I think personally that we have enough legislation. There's a lot of legislation that we have that is not probably being used to its full extent.
Because the agencies don't have enough money to spend executing it, if you like.
I think that is probably a fundamental reason. And then there has been talk about bringing in other types of methodologies, such as Nick Fgrave from the SFO, the director, has talked about incentivising whistleblowers. There's been discussions about when there are deferred prosecution agreements, the sanction amount, how much of that can be recycled into actual law enforcement as opposed to just into Treasury. No, Treasury doesn't like that.
I'm going to spend that. There's a vote in the House. The committee will resume once votes are complete. There may be a couple of votes, but we will be back as soon as we can. But the committee stands suspended. Welcome to the second panel in today's subcommittee hearings on economic crime. Louise, Martin, thank you so much indeed for joining us, and thank you so much for your forbearance as we perform our democratic obligations this afternoon. I'm really grateful for you for hanging around. Louise, perhaps I could start with you. So we've heard some quite alarming evidence this morning from our expert testimony that suggested that there are LLPs which are on the register today, which are engaged in sanctions evasion and potentially money laundering as well as weapons smuggling. Could you just give us a sense of how problematic the Companies House register is today, in your opinion? We realise that you're on a journey of transformation. 18 months on, what the subcommittee needs to know is where you feel you've got to on that journey, and what are the chief risks which you as the chief executive now feel are still open?
Yeah, we are actually only a year on from the Act receiving royal assent, so we've had a year where we've been taking action. I think to just kind of widen it out, prior to the Act, we were very constrained in what we could do. Legally, we had to accept information that was provided to us and put it on the register, and that was really frustrating for us. We got a lot of bad press, and that bad press was right and fair, because we were putting information on the register that we could see was fraudulent or wasn't right, but we were legally bound to accept what was provided to us. And we were really pleased to get the new powers that were given to us in the Act. And in Companies House, we're really committed to using those powers to be making a difference. But, as somebody said this morning or earlier, it's a tanker that we're turning. There's been years of information being provided to us, and criminals have evolved during that time. And, as we start to use the new powers, we are also seeing them continue to evolve. So I don't think there will be a quick fix to this. We need to just keep pushing on, and each step we take forward will make a difference.
As we sit here this afternoon, just tell me what are the top three worries that you have about the integrity of the operation today? When we think this committee is worried about our nation's protections against economic crime, you're stewarding one of the most important defences that we have. As the Chief Executive, what are the sort of two or three top things that you are most worried about as we sit here this afternoon?
I think I'm worried that we are about to implement IDV, identity verification of the people. That is a massive undertaking, and it is a massive step forward in terms of us being able to know who we're dealing with. That is due to go live on a voluntary basis next month, and then compulsorily from autumn this year. We will have to get between 6 and 7 million individuals through that identity verification process. We're aiming to do it within a year, because the sooner we do it and we complete that process, the more powers we will have to, or the more evidence we'll have to be able to take action against people. An added dimension to that is that we will have to get through people with foreign passports that aren't biometric, that will have to have additional measures to be able to verify their identity. But that's a big undertaking, but it is such an important step in the fight against economic crime that it's important that we get it right. And
have you told ministers that task is doable?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we think it's doable, otherwise we wouldn't be continuing, we'd be doing something else. It's just, it's risky. I'm not so worried about the identity verification of UK nationals with the biometric passports, because we're using One Login, which is the government system that is being proven and is being used extensively across government. But I am worried about those edge cases. I'm also concerned about the impact that, because we're tying it to one of the 2 filings that people have to do with us, which is their confirmation statement. And the way we're approaching it is if the directors haven't gone through the identity verification process, then they can't file their documents with us, which is the incentive for people to do it. But on the other hand, we could end up with a serious non-compliance problem that would cause us some difficulties operationally in trying to resolve. And, you know, our primary goal is to achieve compliance on the register and to make sure that the register is as accurate and the integrity of the register is as good as possible. And so with a big non-compliance problem, that would cause some difficulties.
Okay. Any other warning notes that you'd like to sound at this stage before some of these very significant changes come into force?
I suppose it's just the scale. I mean, the scale of change. It's interesting in the earlier panel when people were talking about, do we need more resources? You know, to be fair, we've had the resources. We've had a lot of support from government in terms of the money we've asked for so far. We've got another spending review coming, but the money we've asked for, the resources we've asked for, we've been given. And a lot of it we've been able to fund through fees, so that is helpful to us in terms of the public purse. But the scale of change is enormous, and Companies House is a relatively small organisation. We've increased dramatically. We're at about 1,800 people now, compared to about 700 or 800 when I started in the organisation. But
many of us on this committee have been through big government transformation programmes. A couple of us have been ministers when we've had officials come to us and say, look, this has not gone as we thought. Actually, it's going a bit wrong. We need some significant extra resources. Do you foresee that there is a risk that Companies House will need to ask for extra resources to deliver the programme of change in the next 12 months?
We've got the money for the resources for the next 12 months, yes. What I was trying to get to was it's that capacity. For us at the moment, just throwing resources in wouldn't necessarily help us, because for example, we've got to deliver, we've got a very full digital agenda. Saying to me we can have more resources doesn't help, because we have a recruitment problem as it is, where, like many government departments, we can't attract the digital resources that we need because the pay isn't good enough.
How many open vacancies have you got roughly today?
I can tell you that. Sorry. I can't find it.
About 15% vacancy rate.
Yeah.
That's high, 15%.
Yeah, a lot of them in the digital space, which is where we do find the most difficulty recruiting. We don't have difficulty recruiting operational staff. We're lucky on our locations, South Wales, Belfast and Edinburgh, attractive in terms of operational staff. Martin, in your area, you do have some difficulty, don't you? High turnover.
Yeah, I think it's just the competition in the market. I mean, particularly in South Wales where we're based, our main head office, there are quite large other government departments that are moving similar kind of resources into that space. So people like HMRC, DWP, Immigration Intelligence. So even where we had good success initially recruiting people in, they could see the change in Companies House, really attractive place to come and work.
So in digital roles, what's the vacancy rate in digital roles?
I'll have to find that piece of paper, I'm sorry. I think it's about 20%, so it's more than our normal.
That's quite high.
But it's particular areas. Business analysts, we've had difficulty with architects. So there's other areas that are fine, but particular, and obviously when you're making a lot of change, you need good business analysis to be able to deliver.
Have you got a sense of what the churn rate is each year in digital roles?
No, I haven't got that to hand.
Okay.
I can provide.
Let's see if we can get that on the record too in correspondence. Let me turn to Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Swain, last time that you gave evidence, you said that you couldn't quite give us a sort of clear estimate of the percentage of companies on the register that contained false information. Have you got any further in being able to give any figures on that at the moment?
The figure we were working at when we started reform, we were looking at legislation, was around 5%, which was based on a statistical analysis of fraud across the public sector. So we were using reasonable evidence to kind of base that upon. I think there's a commentary out there that this could be as high as 20%, which is going to be around about 1.2 million companies. When we say they're there for suspicious purposes, or they could be there with errors on the register, or they could be there for criminal purposes. But for our planning purposes, we are using that range, basically, and we're probably erring towards the higher figure.
1.2 million.
Given our experience in the last 12 months, and I think the activity we've seen on the register, I mean, if you were tracking what happened when the bill came in, we saw a massive increase in what we describe as mass incorporations, where in the main, overseas-based people were incorporating literally thousands of companies at single addresses or multiple addresses in a street. We never expected that spike. So, you know, for my planning purposes, in terms of trying to disrupt that activity, we are working at the upper end. I think what I can tell the committee is that we are learning more and more about the types of companies that are there. So certainly from a mass incorporation perspective, we were able to track that typology and intervene. So we are stopping companies getting on the register where we know there are known addresses, or what I define as addresses of concern.
Do you have a model that you've sort of developed that is that, you know, these flags are going up and they're pinging, and have you got sort of software that you have or are creating based on that analysis that you're doing?
Yeah, so we've invested, one of the developments we put quite a bit of money into was something called the cloud data platform. So basically we were able to put all of our data into the cloud, into a single, I mean the data analyst will give a far more better explanation than me, but it effectively puts all the data in one place. So when the analysts want to run those risk flags, they effectively pull the data down instead of trying to pull it from all different places. I mean, one of the things we're careful about is talking too openly about some of this approach that we take, because clearly that tips off people who are trying to do things on the register. But investing in that technology enables certainly analysts in my intelligence team to easily access data and information. We use tools like Power BI to build systems where we can try and look at what's coming in incorporation. Some of our data scientists did some really good work around the address misuse issue, actually, where we were trying to predict, using risk flags, we were trying to predict where we could see an address being hijacked. And actually, when we trialled it, we had a really good success rate. So you can use quite a lot of what we describe as machine learning techniques. Obviously, our Chief Data Officer is very actively exploring how artificial intelligence can be brought into our systems to really help us. The challenge we have quite often is some of the issues we're trying to solve. Even when you deploy AI or machine learning, it ultimately ends up with an individual member of our team to look at it in more detail. But where we were last time, I don't think I could ever give you a figure, because things move and organised criminals change their typology, so we don't see the mass incorporations at single addresses now. We see a different typology that we're tracking and constantly trying to intervene. The best intervention we can make is at the front end, is to actually stop the company being incorporated in the first place. So again, we are trying to invest in that quite heavily in terms of technology, but also putting people around that area of work.
So what's, just hand on heart, what's your own personal sense of the number of fraudulent companies? If you had to kind of put a finger on a number, what's your own kind of gut feel?
I mean, the danger with me putting my gut feel and my figure is that I'm held to it, but I would probably say, I would probably say it's towards the upper end of that kind of 15 to 20%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which kind of illustrates the scale of the challenge.
It really does.
But also that we don't necessarily, that changing of what the criminals are doing when they can see what we're doing.
It's important for us because as a committee we have to hold your ministers to account for
Yeah.
ensuring you have the right resources to do the job. So for us to kind of just understand as frontline professionals the scale of the task that you think you've got, it's really important for us as a committee to understand that.
Understand.
Charlie Maynard.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for being here. Talking to Ray Blake just at the end of the last session. So his firm kind of runs on a private basis, 150, let's call them red flags or kind of concerns. I mean, so much of this is just about automation. And it's not, frankly, it doesn't smell that hard to be like, okay, so if, let's say, somebody puts in $1 trillion as their, so that's a red flag. I mean, this isn't kind of incredibly complicated computer science. So what I'm trying to understand is, are you running that? And most importantly, when you run that and you're seeing multiple red flags, what teeth are you using to take that company down? Because it should, that feedback loop to action should be pretty quick.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are two things for me. I mentioned just now the kind of preventative approach. Where we see flags at the incorporation stage, we now have a power to question those pieces of information, and if we believe they're false, then we can reject the incorporation. And I think since the powers that were given to us, we've rejected about 8,500 incorporations, which doesn't sound a lot, but this is about testing and trialling and making sure we're doing it in the right way. This also, we have to adopt some kind of risk approach here as well, because in the true spirit of Companies Act legislation, even though we've got new powers, if somebody incorporates a company and they include all of the information that's required for an incorporation, even if we believe it to be false, technically it is compliant with the requirements of the legislation to incorporate. We are challenging back on that quite heavily.
Just on that, who do you need to challenge back, and how quick is that happening? Because I mean, this, we've got criminal acts going on in front of our eyes. Yeah. Nobody wants that to happen. So who makes the decision on that?
That would be our teams in Companies House. So we're giving our teams that ability, in a sense, to understand what they're looking for. So take the high share capital as an example. We can now train our teams to say, right, we don't believe that's correct. When companies come in, you're absolutely right, it's about flags. So a flag is high share capital, a flag in a jurisdiction. It's about building those flags into the system at the front end. I mean, we have a series of business rules now which fire on incorporation. So if somebody tries to use a company name that's got a sensitive word in it, for example, then our system will fire a rule. The company won't incorporate, and it will get given to an examiner to look at, and it will be rejected. So we've got the ability to build in rules. I mentioned the addresses issue that we've been tracking. We've been trialling some work there where we were building some upfront rules around particular locations, particular addresses, which enables the team then to get it stopped at the front end. I mean, that's the best way we can do it. That's the best investment we can make.
And just kind of going on that, so we've got identity coming down, so April and then autumn, and then you've got a kind of 12-month implementation period. How much are you saying, okay, at the end of 12 months, if you have not done this, the following is going to happen? Because otherwise it's just kind of stretches, because it's like, oh, well, you can't file, and that's another year. Yeah. So in terms of sanction, what is the toughest sanction you can have if they fail to put their identities down within that 12-month period? What would you like to see happen to stop these guys continuing as businesses?
So if somebody fails to IDV during the transition, they're committing an offence immediately at the end of that transition. So they can't act as a director if they've failed to ID verify. So our first sanction, in a sense, is to say you cannot act as a director anymore.
But the company can carry on trading?
Well, this is where we need to look at what's in the company, because if it's a single director company and the director's not verified, to my mind, the company is essentially becoming defunct because there is nobody there to run the company.
But let's just say, okay, let's run with that. So they're like, well, there's nobody officially there, but I'm still making the decisions and running that company just fine. So what happens then?
I would move to strike the company off the register.
Okay, and so if you're seeing that, what would be the timeline between action? So we've got to the end of that period, and then all of these these people are not on it, they don't have their IDs, what kind of strike-off period would it be?
So what I would say as well is it won't be at the end, because we're phasing this in over 12 months. So as confirmation statements become due, people will need to verify their identities to be able to file their confirmation statement. So the minute we start transition in autumn of this year, as soon as companies' confirmation statements become due, they will have to go through ID verification, provide us with a unique identifier to be able to file their confirmation statement. So our system will trigger the minute their confirmation statement's not filed, literally at 1 minute to midnight on that date, our system will fire and say they're in default. And at the moment, if that happens to you, you get a letter from us basically saying if you don't comply within a period of time, we'll move to strike your company off.
Okay.
So you've immediately got two offences, because you've got a failure to verify, so you're acting as a director without being verified. You've got an offence of not filing your confirmation statement. So to my mind, this is part of the deal of having limited liability. And the protection of limited liability is there are legal requirements to meet. My whole stance on enforcement, which Louise supports me on, is that we have to be tough. If you don't comply with the legal requirements, we're not going to let you carry on having a company if you're not going to comply. So the ultimate sanction is we strike the company from the register. In terms of time, how long it currently takes about 70 to 90 days to go through the Gazette process to strike a company off. We'll have new powers shortly to what we call expedite strike-off, so we'll be able to do it within 28 days. And the other kind of point in all of this, which I probably want to make, is we're dealing with a massive population of companies. And one of the things that we've brought in during the last 12 months is a much more targeted approach to compliance, because in my mind, what you want to get to first are what we call serially non-compliant companies. So if you've never filed your accounts on time, if you fail to file a confirmation statement repeatedly, if you don't file change of director forms when they need to be changed, if you don't verify, I'm probably going to come down far tougher on you than somebody who normally files everything and has just managed not to verify because their document didn't quite meet the standard, for example.
Yeah. Okay.
You've got to take that segmented approach.
I'm going to just speed us up a bit.
If you've got a high level suspicion that a company is committing some crime, when do you start getting collateral information from other agencies, and what's the process from there?
So we get lots of information and intelligence. I mean, that's one of the things that's changed over the last 12 months. We've become far more part of that kind of economic crime ecosystem. So we get lots of information from other agencies. I just mentioned the expedited strike-off power. That's one of the things that's linked specifically to Louise's fourth objective in the legislation, which is not to allow companies to be formed or used for criminal purposes. So if we got intelligence, for example, or information that a company was engaged in criminal activity, we could take the decision to use that power immediately and look to strike that company off.
Okay. We just wanted to double check some money. So there's a 30 million loss in 2023-24.
Yeah, that was due to, so the Act had received royal assent. We were in the middle of so that was in the autumn.
Yeah.
We were in the middle of recruiting, and civil service, was it called 25, SES 25 came along, which was around reducing the size of the civil service at the same time as our business case to increase the fees was in with Treasury for approval. Yeah. So it got held up for a considerable amount of time because obviously our business case was predicated on increasing our staff, and eventually we did increase the fees in May.
Yeah. There was just a lag on the fees.
It was a lag, so we had to carry on to prepare for the Act.
And then autumn budget, Treasury announced 400 million, shared between Companies House and others. Do you know how much of that 400 million came to Companies House?
In 24-25, we were delegated 29.6 million.
29.6.
And we have 25-26 budgets are not set yet.
Okay, so it's actually a pretty small fraction. Okay. John Cooper, did you want to come in?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, excuse me. In February 24, Companies House told this committee's predecessor that you had recruited 216 out of 241 new staff as a result of reforms to enforcement. You touched earlier on the resources and the capacity you've got, but at that time the target figure I think was to recruit 320 people. I just wondered where you are now, how many you've brought in to date as a result of the reforms.
What was your first year?
24, I think it was February 24.
24.
Yeah.
So in 24, we were at 1310. Now we're at 1748, and we're forecasting to be in March 26 at 2377.
2377. Okay. And looking at that capacity and resource then, do you feel that you have got enough staff to materially reduce fraud and false filing? Are you comfortable with those figures?
Yes, because that's what we've estimated and we've put in. I think it will be, those figures will be enough to get us through the IDV period. To Martin's area's increase, I think he had about 3 or 4 people at the beginning of that. He's at 60 now. He will go up to 100 by the end of the year. So we're resourcing up, but we need to do it in a way that is manageable in terms of recruiting, actually recruiting that number of people puts a strain on the organisation in terms of job adverts, interviews, all of that. Inducting that many people in our operational areas, now we've got large numbers of new people, and we need to be careful that we don't tip over to a point where we haven't got enough experience or enough organisational knowledge to be actually running the system as well, because I know this committee's focus is on economic crime, but actually, we're a large service organisation meeting the needs of the 5 million companies out there in terms of their requirements. So we need to make sure that we can keep the show on the road in terms of business as usual. But we are recruiting up, and we're bringing significant numbers of people to support that IDV journey. With 469 FTE are included in that figure to support companies through that journey. And we've based that on a 10% increase in kind of noise in the system as we're going through it. And we've also got contingency with the HMRC surge capacity for an extra 201 roles if we need them, if that noise turns out to be more than we anticipated.
Yeah. Okay, John Glenn.
Yeah, that leads me on to just the kind of mix of people that you've got. Can you break down by proportions what sort of numbers you've got in terms of professionally qualified accountants, lawyers, financial crime practitioners?
Want to do the...
Yeah, because the latter two sit in my area. So we've increased our legal team from what was 3 people to 12 already, and we'll be looking to bring in 1 or 2 more. These are a mix of kind of company law experts who work on the advisory side, but we've also brought some prosecutors in. So we've got some ex-CPS people, and they'll be picking up more of the enforcement work that we want to take forward. And we're looking at bringing in a litigation lawyer in as well, because the challenge when we're issuing lots of penalties and taking lots of prosecutions is that we get lots of appeals. And we actually saw that when we started to do it on Row.
So within the enforcement group within Companies House, how many people do you think are going to be living in the enforcement group this year?
If you take, for example, intelligence and enforcement, I would say we'd be around 300 to 350. But that will probably grow. We'll have resources, for example, that will pick up as we implement IDV. There'll be specific enforcement resources that will look at enforcing non-verification. So working on that. So that will continue to grow, and I can't see that reducing in the short to medium term.
Okay.
But also, I don't think all of them need to be law enforcement professionals. A lot of our enforcement activity we develop a process and then people can follow it. They don't, so we need the specialists in there, but also we need the generalists to be enforcing it and dealing with it.
Any more?
No, thank you.
Yeah, could I ask you, you've explained to us quite reasonably, when you surge staff, increase number of staff, you've got to think about business as usual versus the changed organisation, what it looks like. We also discussed through the Chair's questions about the gaps you've got, 15 to 20% unfilled. Could I ask you about whether you think you've got the right freedom to designate roles for tasks, to create incentives for performance, to actually create the right culture for productivity? Because there's one thing to fill the roles and go through the process, but we talked about, Mr. Swain talked about the challenge with other entities in the area being more offering a different option for employment. One of the big challenges we face across the public sector is productivity. Do you have enough flexibility when you get your money from the Treasury to spend it in a way that optimises the productivity of the staff that you have?
That's a good question. I think, to the first point you asked, I think I have the freedom to recruit, to construct my workforce how I think is right. I don't think we have the freedom in relation to pay to be able to flex to meet what the market demands. But we have particular issues in that departments typically either pay more for the same as what is in agencies, or they grade roles higher, which makes it very difficult for us in some cases. We'll have people who leave us to go to a job that at the same grade in another department that's £15,000 more, and we can't even compete with that.
So what I'm getting at is that you've got a really tough job to catch up with people who are doing dodgy things in more sophisticated ways.
Yeah.
You need the cutting edge staff, not people who are sort of looking over their shoulder to find a better job back in the home department or the sponsoring department.
Yeah.
It seems to me that you can have the resources, but if you can't spend it in the right way, it's questionable whether the resource level is relevant.
Yeah.
You get into this sort of conversation because I remember being asked to sign off things as a minister, saying, where there was a special request for a derogation from a pay scale. But the default was we'd be very reluctant to do that because the implications and precedent set would be difficult. Do you ever have that opportunity, and do you recognise that tension, and what can be done about it?
I recognise the tension. I suppose I would say we've got some very good people, so it's not.
I'm not.
I don't want.
So, nonetheless, you recognise the challenge you face.
Yeah, and I think that there's difficulty sometimes. So we bring in, for example, contractors with specialist experience, but again, there are restrictions around that. And we have to be careful that we don't go over various. Spend controls.
Let's ask the question like this. You got a 20% vacancy rate on digital skills, and you're about to embark on one of the most important identity verification projects in His Majesty's government. Do you need more flexibility on what you can pay to who to get the right skills on deck to get that job done?
Yes, that would be nice.
Okay,
good question. Better than I did.
Sorry, Maynard.
Didn't expect me to say no to that.
Talking about fines. So 2019, 2020, Companies House collected 57%. 23-24, collection rate dropped to 46%. Between 18-19 and 23-24, you failed to collect 386 million of issued fines. What's going on with the collection rate, and what needs to? Well, I'm interested to understand what that is in absolute terms, say last year, but also fundamentally, why are these not being collected? Is it? Well, I can guess, but you go for it.
Well, during the pandemic, we saw a change in behaviour. So we saw more late filings, which is understandable. People had other things on their minds. But we also saw less people paying. And that behaviour didn't really revert back post-pandemic. So the level of fines has increased and the level of people not paying has increased, and that's continued over time. We also had, during the pandemic, COVID easements, which gave people extensions, and it's kind of messed up the system, really. But we are, so there's been an increase in bad debt provision.
What about consequences? So if you don't pay your fine, what happens, and is that actually happening?
So if you take, for example, after the Economic Crime Bill, after the Economic Crime Act came into force, how many prosecutions have followed from fine non-payment?
I haven't got that. Have you got the figure for
No, we'd have to do the figures.
Yeah, we'd have to do the figures.
Okay.
People get CCJs as a result of not paying their late filing penalties, and we are looking at whether that is a sufficient.
Just CCJs, just
court judgments.
Criminal court judgments?
County court
judgments,
yeah.
Right, okay.
And so we're looking at whether that is a sufficient deterrent. We're also looking at, can we use some of the legislative tools that the Act has given us, such as annotation of the register, which would be a good signal for people that, this company hasn't paid what they should do. We're also having a look at the appeal window, because it's a bit... at the moment, it's quite open-ended, and so what happens is people get quite a long way through the process of not paying before they suddenly think, oh, well, we'll make an appeal, and then it goes into a 4-stage process, which I think is too many, that takes quite a long time, and all that time the bad debt is ageing, and it can...
Are you the author of that process? Are you able to change that process as Companies House, or do you need...
I think we can change it ourselves.
Okay. Would you be up for making, let's say in a month's time, making a set of recommendations saying, okay, we want to, if we're going to address our fines backlog, we would like to be changing our processes this way, that way, and the other way, and just list those out and stick them in the public domain somewhere? Just say this is what we're going to do, or what we'd like to do.
If it helps, I can write you with the question, and you can answer it. Okay. Thank you. Sir Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Smyth, you said in your strategic intelligence assessment that the £50 fee to incorporate a company is highly unlikely to deter fraudulent mass incorporation. So is there a level of fee that would stop that? Is that the way that it could be, worked?
I think the increase from 12 to 50 would stop the frivolous, because obviously, as Martin's told, we segment the market. There's there's lower level criminal activity that probably, you might be prepared to lose 12 quid to do something minor, but 50 quid is a bit more. I don't know that there is a figure that would stop the serious criminals, because, the amount of fraud that they can commit on the back of an incorporation, I don't know that figure, but I could imagine that it's pretty high in some cases, and it would be worth it to them. So, you could say we'd put it up to 100, but I don't think that would be enough either.
And so what about, the new powers you've got, the new responsibilities you've got, what Mr. Swain has got to look after, and making sure that, there's compliance now, that, the ID checks are being done. That surely incurs a cost to you as an organisation. Have you looked at what that cost actually is? And going forward, when you're introducing all of these new elements to the checks. So is £50 going to cover all of these new parts of that process, in making sure that when somebody says, I'm going to incorporate a company, whether they go through or whether they flag or not, but they go through that process, does £50 cover that work?
No, it won't go forward. We're looking at fees again now.
Yes, okay.
And we'll be coming back with some...
You'll remember Baroness Hodge and I moved amendments to the bill that suggested a much higher registration fee. What's your sense of where it needs to be? I mean, does it need to be more like £400?
The issue is for us that the fee is set to recover our costs.
Indeed.
So it can't necessarily be a kind of a figure that we pluck out of the air that we say would deter criminal activity.
But let's say this committee recommended that you triple, the number of enforcement staff from 350 to something closer to 1,000, which many people would argue is the kind of level, a minimum level actually, to deal with the threat. We would then we could then tease that through into what the fee needed to be.
Yeah, but we would have to do that over time in order to continue to be a viable organisation. We couldn't just tomorrow go out with a load of job adverts and
I see.
I mean, you've got... Yeah.
I understand the point you're making. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just interested in this dynamic of the fees and the recovery and the costs. If you increase the fee to levels suggested, what are the implications in terms of behaviours of potential registrants? I mean, it's possible that people will not engage, or is there any risk associated with that?
Yeah, I think you'd have to do some analysis on what impact that would have, because it's very easy to get caught up in everyone on the register is trying to commit crime. The vast majority of people aren't, and so I think you would need to do some analysis to judge whether 400 would be too much for your small businessman who's trying to set up a company. You could argue that if you haven't got 400 quid, then it's
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is, do you not think it would be necessary to do an assessment of the behavioural effect of increasing the fees at a significant level?
Yeah.
And can I just check, you got new powers to criminally prosecute directors over and above the CCJ proceedings. Have those powers been used in anger yet to actually criminally prosecute?
No, we haven't. I mean, that's the next thing that we need to get on to is prosecutions. When we were had the headcount restrictions as a result of CS25, we carried on recruiting to deliver the powers, and because that was what was coming first for us, and the sanctions would come later. And so we didn't actually develop the sanctions side of it, our thinking on that, until the autumn. And we are running some, obviously the Act gave us a number of different things that we could use in terms of our enforcement strategy on companies, and in some ways, penalties are as effective for us.
But don't you think that, as Mr. Neidle said this afternoon, that we need a clear signal that there are consequences for misbehaviour? Don't you think that criminally prosecuting people would have sent a very clear signal that you meant business?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we've done enough in this space, and that is next on our agenda in terms of priority.
Can you briefly?
In terms of modelling, have you looked at modelling of other countries that maybe are doing a better job when it comes to fees and prosecutions, and we can maybe learn from some of their best practice and can be implemented in the UK?
Well, we do look at different... I mean, I've got the figures on. We're about in the middle in terms of fees compared with the other countries that we benchmark against. They're also very different. So, the way company registers operate is very different. So, a lot of the, for example, in Germany, they have to go to a judge, and there's a lot more in setting up a company. And so for me, it's all about balance, and it's finding the right level of intervention and requirements on companies so that you're encouraging the economic growth as well as having enough in place to deter the economic crime. And so where that lands I think is different.
You think that we could be maybe learning, or we could take segments of it from other countries and maybe implement it here?
Yeah, and we absolutely will look at countries all around the world that are trying to do similar things or have done similar things, and we're part of international networks where we're frequently talking to other registers about, how they approach compliance, how they approach enforcement. It's interesting, the fee argument, because some of the jurisdictions that I've spoken to where they've got really high fees, in excess of 400, like 1,000, 2,000 euros to register a company, still have the same problems of significant money laundering through their corporate structures, fraud, etc. So even where the fee is really high, it doesn't disincentivize.
So a high fee may not be a deterrent, but it may give you the resources to strengthen enforcement.
Yes.
The clock is slightly against us, but Mr. Brickell, let me hand the floor to you, and it would be helpful actually just to pick up some of your points about overseas territories as well.
Yeah, I'll come to those in a second if I may. I wanted to ask about authorised corporate service providers, ACSPs. The legislation allows for those to be used to allow for identification and verification. How many of those are there? And what are the circumstances in which a company can use an ACSP as opposed to doing verification directly with Companies House?
ACSPs are a new thing under the Act, and we went live yesterday with registration for people to be ACSPs. We're expecting to get, hold on, went live yesterday. How many we expect? Is it 5,000? 50,000. 50,000 all kind of businesses register for that, and so ACSPs will be need to be regulated by a supervisory body. HMRC is one of them. There are others, but we will have the. Sorry, I'm answering questions you haven't answered. I'm getting.
So what circumstances would a company be able to go through verification through an ACSP as opposed to directly through yourselves?
It's a choice.
Okay, and what oversight will Companies House or HMRC be exercising over the operation of that choice, and also what assurance will be able to be provided around the quality of the checks that those ACSPs provide?
So although ACSPs will be supervised by other bodies, we will be able to we'll do spot checks, and what we'll do, we'll take a risk-based approach to it. So if we think from our analysis that ACSPs are allowing people to go through verification and say that they've done it, and by the look of it we think that they're not legitimate, we will be able to then, we can ask, we'll be doing spot checks on anybody we want to, but we will segment it so that we try and identify the high-risk ones, and we'll be then asking them to
you accept there's a risk potentially that some ACSPs could be rogue operators, for instance, that could allow verification to take place?
There is a risk, yes.
Okay. On overseas territories and crown dependencies, perhaps you could talk a little bit to some of the complexities that arise from company registration that's tied to beneficial owners, or other corporate structures that are incorporated in those jurisdictions. Does that play out in some of the intelligence work that you do? And if so, how does it present itself?
This is the Register of Overseas Entities that you're referring to. I think we're at a phase now with that register where we've got about 32,000 entities registered. We think there are about 4,000 more that were in scope. So these are entities that at Land Registry still have titles against their names. We're just completing a big data exercise to establish whether those entities still exist, because it's highly likely that some of them have dissolved or been struck off in their jurisdiction. If I'm honest, it is a challenge because ever since the European Court of Justice ruling on beneficial ownership registers, there's been a kind of move back towards keeping beneficial ownership registers private, which doesn't really help us in terms of establishing whether those entities exist and there's people on their register. But we have just completed a really big exercise to understand those 4,000 who are still there. I mentioned our collaboration internationally. That is starting to kind of be beneficial to us in terms of a register-to-register relationship. I can't say that it's as positive with all of them, but there are certainly some jurisdictions that are starting to say, on an intelligence-to-intelligence basis, we are willing to have conversations with you. So it's a developing area for us, but it is a challenge as well, because we are dealing with some jurisdictions that are very secretive.
And is that intelligence shared directly to yourselves, or does that come through law enforcement agencies or the regulators?
Both. So we do sometimes have intelligence shared directly with us, but we obviously work closely with the National Crime Agency and the National Economic Crime Centre, where there are various international cells that operate, where we are now part of those operational cells. So if we need to, we can always go via the NCA and through their gateways to share information with other countries and their agencies.
In terms of British overseas territories then, we've got some that feel, it seems to us like they're playing ball, others that aren't. Which are the British overseas territories that need to make faster progress in terms of getting their registers of beneficial ownership sorted out and open for scrutiny?
Probably more a question for the department, I guess, because I know the department has got a stream of work that's been funded through the crime levy funding to kind of work with overseas territories and Crown dependencies to kind of push that forward.
You can definitely ask the department, but I just wondered, as a frontline professional trying to keep the country safe, where are the places that...
Probably wouldn't want to jeopardise my conversations with them by saying who are being more positive and who isn't, to be honest.
Okay, but there are some that are problematic.
I think there are countries that are problematic around the world in terms of being able to share information with us.
Some of those are British overseas territories.
Yeah.
Chair, thank you. So, I mean, at least as per our notes, Cayman Islands and British Virgin Islands are two that were flagged. And then I kind of reading November 24 communique, which I remember hearing about. I mean, it's really disappointing. I mean, it says, we note the UK's government's ambition that publicly accessible registers of beneficial ownerships, PARBOs, become a global norm, and its expectation that overseas territories and Crown dependents to implement full PARBOs. We note, which basically is saying we're not going to do anything, and if our government was going to act on this, what would be the steps that would be required to actually take some action that would make a difference here?
Again, I'm not dodging the question, but I think it is something more for the department. But I mean, my position would be economic crime is a global issue, and when you're trying to tackle economic crime, if territories or countries' registers were as open as ours, then that would make the job far more easy.
Martin, I'm just to interrupt, sorry, but I'm not actually advocating you're advocating these things. I'm just asking, what are the steps, if a government was to act, what would be the key steps that would make a difference? I'm not saying that you support those steps or not, but just what are those steps?
Developing an open register in that territory?
Yeah, and how to make that happen?
I mean, I suppose learn the lessons from our own experience of doing that in the UK, and the way in which we implemented our PSC register. And there are certain benefits in terms of the way we did that, and some really positives. I think looking back, there were also some learnings that we took from that, which is, I guess, why the department is in the space of trying to help these territories to do this.
Such as, what were those key learnings or key steps that made a difference?
I mean, I suppose understanding the scale of it. I think some of the issues that Dan Neidle raised this morning around being really tight on the requirements about who can register and who can't. So, we absolutely take what he's published today in terms of those overseas companies that have found their way onto our register because the registration process hasn't stopped it. So I guess there's lots of learnings, but that would be one key learning for me, is if you put in place a legal requirement, make sure it's followed through, and don't implement systems of registration which enable it to be bypassed.
Yeah, okay. I'm afraid the clock has defeated us. Thank you very much indeed, Louise and Martin, for your evidence and indeed for your work. That's been extremely helpful. We hope that we're able to see Companies House every 6 months over the course of this Parliament, because this is such an important part of our defences against economic crime. But that concludes this panel and that concludes this session.